But I believe that God has given me power, and there's the power of the Holy Spirit. When you lift up Jesus Christ.
A household name in evangelical America just faced the reckoning that many thought would never come, and what transpired will reshape how we view faith, politics, and power in this country. For decades, one of the nation's most recognized spiritual leaders has commanded attention through his vast humanitarian initiatives, international crusades, and unwavering connection to the highest levels of government. His journey appeared unstoppable, yet whispers of controversy have trailed him like a shadow, building layer upon layer into something impossible to ignore. Now, at a critical juncture, those mounting questions have forced a moment of reckoning that few believed possible. But what really happened? And how did it reach this breaking point? Join us as we examine the complete story. The man in question has spent half a century building networks of influence, commanding stages across continents, and positioning himself as a spiritual authority without parallel. Yet despite all this prominence, something was shifting beneath the surface. Each public statement seemed to ignite fresh firestorms. Every controversial position appeared to deepen the divide between supporters who saw unwavering conviction and critics who perceived something far more troubling. As scrutiny intensified, people began asking whether this chapter of his public influence was approaching its inevitable conclusion. Would this be the moment everything changed? Could redemption still be possible? Or had the damage become permanent? The weight of accumulated controversy has rarely pressed harder on any contemporary religious figure. Now, after years of tension and debate, we're looking at how one man's legacy reached its defining moment. What transformed everything? And why did it matter so much to so many people? The early signs of controversy. In the opening decades of his public ministry, one particular aspect of his messaging began drawing significant attention and resistance. During interviews conducted in the early 2000s, he made sweeping statements about world religions that immediately sparked concern among interfaith organizations and civil rights groups. His characterization of certain faiths during media appearances suggested a worldview that left little room for coexistence or religious pluralism. The pivotal moment came during a prominent media interview where he used language that many interpreted as inflammatory toward Islam and its followers worldwide. He argued that certain theological teachings within that faith created inherent conflict with Western values and democratic principles. The reaction was swift and unprecedented. Within weeks, organized groups had mobilized against him. In 2003, when he was invited to deliver a blessing at a major Pentagon ceremony, opposition materialized from multiple quarters. Religious organizations representing millions of believers formally protested his appearance, concerned about the message it would send. More than 75 government employees signed a joint petition requesting event organizers cancel his participation. They worried that elevating his profile would legitimize what they viewed as discriminatory rhetoric. Remarkably, despite this organized pushback, the ceremony proceeded as planned. Yet the controversy refused to fade away quietly. In 2010, event organizers for a national prayer gathering made a different choice. They withdrew his invitation, citing the very same concerns about divisive statements. His supporters contended he was being persecuted for his religious convictions, while opponents maintained they were holding him accountable for promoting harmful stereotypes. This pattern would repeat itself with growing frequency. International travel became complicated. In 2017, British immigration authorities began blocking his entry, fearing his presence might inflame tensions within their own Muslim communities. The restrictions persisted for years. Each controversy added another layer to the mounting evidence that influence could be lost as quickly as it was gained. But what lay ahead would overshadow everything that came before: political entanglement and rising stakes. Around this same period, his alignment with American political movements deepened significantly. What began as informal support evolved into something far more visible and consequential. He became a fixture at major political events, offering prayers and spiritual endorsement to candidates and their campaigns. By the mid-2010s, his political involvement had become central to his public identity. In 2015, he made a dramatic announcement. He was leaving the political party he'd supported for decades and declaring himself independent. The stated reason was frustration with mainstream party politics, yet he continued supporting specific political candidates and causes closely aligned with conservative evangelical concerns. His reasoning seemed selective to many observers. When he initially suggested interest in a particular political candidate for the 2012 election, his endorsement carried weight. He described this candidate as embodying the values he believed America needed. However, he also praised other politicians at different moments, suggesting his political calculations were more complex than simple loyalty. By 2016, everything changed. He became deeply invested in supporting a particular presidential candidate, one whose background and personal history were unconventional for someone seeking evangelical support. This alignment confused many longtime followers who remembered his previous statements about character and moral leadership. After this candidate won the presidency, Graham's explanations became increasingly theological. He suggested divine intervention had determined the outcome. He claimed to sense spiritual movements across the nation that pointed toward this specific result. In interviews, he invoked religious language to explain what many political analysts attributed to conventional political factors and voter preferences. When faith becomes indistinguishable from politics, the credibility of both becomes questionable. This deepening political entanglement created a unique vulnerability. Critics argued he'd compromised his spiritual authority by becoming too visibly aligned with partisan causes. Supporters countered that he was simply living out his convictions in the public sphere, exercising his democratic rights as a citizen. The tension between these two perspectives would intensify dramatically. The AI image controversy. In 2024, a technological development thrust him back into the center of national controversy. An artificial intelligence-generated image circulated widely across social networks, and the image's composition raised immediate concerns about religious messaging and political appropriation. The image depicted a political figure in flowing white garments with supernatural-appearing elements suggesting spiritual authority or divine connection. Religious imagery and symbolism appeared woven throughout the composition. For many observers, the implications were clear. This was a deliberate attempt to associate political power with sacred religious concepts, blurring the boundaries between temporal and spiritual authority. The public reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. Religious leaders from across the theological spectrum condemned the image. Conservative evangelical voices, often allied with the figure in question, broke ranks to express concern. They worried the image crossed fundamental lines regarding how religious symbolism should be deployed in political contexts. The image was eventually removed from circulation, but the damage had been done. Questions rippled through the religious and political communities. Had a line been crossed? Had sacred imagery been weaponized for political advantage? And where did our subject stand in this controversy? His response became crucial. Instead of joining the chorus of concern, he offered a spirited defense. He suggested the image had been misinterpreted by critics with predetermined hostile intentions. He argued that observers eager to criticize were reading meanings into the composition that the creator never intended. In his defense, he pointed to the absence of certain traditional religious symbols, specific elements that would have made the religious association unmistakable. His interpretation seemed to downplay what many other observers believed was evident in the image's overall composition and context. This defense itself became controversial. Religious leaders questioned why he felt compelled to defend something that seemed indefensible to them. They wondered whether his close political alignment had compromised his ability to make independent moral judgments. His response suggested loyalty to his political allies might supersede other considerations. Defending the indefensible eventually becomes the argument that destroys you. The unraveling. How contradictions caught up. The accumulation of these moments, the controversial religious statements, the deepening political involvement, The defense of problematic imagery began forming a coherent pattern that critics found increasingly difficult to ignore. Each incident existed independently, but collectively they told a story about priorities and loyalties that troubled many longtime observers. The timeline revealed something unexpected about consistency and conviction. Decades earlier, he had built his reputation on specific religious principles and moral absolutes. He spoke with certainty about right and wrong, about boundaries that should never be crossed. Yet as his political involvement deepened, those clear lines seemed to blur and shift. When questioned about contradictions between his statements from different periods, he offered explanations that sometimes seemed to contradict each other. This evasiveness itself became a problem. People began wondering whether principle or political calculation was actually driving his positions. The theological community watched with growing concern. Religious scholars and denominational leaders began publicly questioning whether his organization and leadership structure properly reflected the values he claimed to represent. Internal tensions emerged within organizations he led, as longtime staff members and supporters grappled with these tensions. The humanitarian work his organizations conducted remained genuinely valuable. Disaster relief efforts in Turkey and Syria in 2023 demonstrated real compassion and organizational capability. Thousands of lives were touched by the resources and expertise his teams deployed in crisis situations. Yet, even these good works began feeling complicated. When he personally visited disaster sites and spoke about the suffering he witnessed, his words carried authority born from genuine engagement with human tragedy. He wasn't simply making political statements. He was witnessing and responding to real pain and loss. But this made the contradictions even harder to reconcile. How could someone so moved by human suffering defend statements that many believed contributed to discrimination and marginalization of vulnerable populations? How could conviction about universal human dignity coexist with selective application of that principle based on religious identity? These questions began asking themselves louder and louder. The sentencing and its meaning. The moment everyone had been discussing finally arrived. What started as abstract debate about credibility and consistency materialized into concrete accountability. The specific nature of the sentencing varied depending on who was evaluating the situation, but the verdict itself felt inevitable to many. For his supporters, this represented persecution of religious conviction. They saw a faithful witness being attacked by an increasingly hostile secular culture that rejected traditional religious values. They believed he was being punished for refusing to compromise his principles, even when that refusal generated controversy and condemnation. Yet this interpretation required overlooking other observable realities. For critics, the accountability represented a long overdue reckoning. They pointed to patterns of problematic statements, selective application of moral principles, and defensive responses to legitimate concerns. They believed consequences finally matched actions and words. The sentencing materialized through multiple channels simultaneously. Organizations reconsidered partnerships and associations. Media outlets re-examined his past statements with fresh critical attention. Institutions he had influenced began distancing themselves from his leadership or public endorsements. Perhaps most significantly, younger generations of evangelicals began questioning his authority. Where once his name commanded immediate respect within religious circles, it now generated debate and criticism from within the very communities that had elevated him. Evangelical leaders who came of age after his most controversial statements began asking whether his framework for understanding faith and politics remained relevant to their concerns and convictions. The influence that seemed permanent had become remarkably fragile. His organizations remained functional and financially viable. The work continued. But the unchallenged cultural authority that had characterized his earlier decades had eroded substantially. People still listened, but they also questioned. Respect existed alongside skepticism, a complicated legacy. To understand the full picture, we must acknowledge multiple truths simultaneously. His humanitarian organizations have demonstrably saved lives and alleviated suffering. The resources deployed during disasters, the medical care provided to vulnerable populations, the emergency assistance offered during crises, these impacts are real and verifiable. Yet genuine good doesn't erase other complications. His personal faith journey demonstrates devotion and spiritual seriousness. He wasn't performing conviction. He genuinely believed deeply in the religious principles he articulated. His family connections, his long marriage, his role as grandfather, these aspects of his life reflect values he actually embodied in private relationships. But authenticity of personal belief doesn't exempt anyone from accountability for public statements or from consequences resulting from those statements. Private virtue and public responsibility operate in different spheres, and confusion between them has caused endless trouble throughout history. A life can contain both genuine goodness and troubling contradictions simultaneously. His relationship with his father, Billy Graham's legacy, adds another layer. He was never simply copying his father's approach. He developed his own distinctive voice and mission. In some ways, that independence represented strength and authenticity. Yet it also meant he made different choices, took different positions, and created different controversies. The question becomes, what defines a legacy when multiple truths coexist? Observers will draw different conclusions based on their own values and priorities. Those who prioritize humanitarian impact will emphasize the lives his organizations have touched. Those who prioritize consistency in moral principle will focus on contradictions and selective applications. Those who prioritize religious freedom will see persecution. Those who believe in accountability will see appropriate consequences. Perhaps this is where we find the most important lesson. Individual human legacies rarely fit neatly into single narratives. We are rarely purely heroes or villains, purely right or purely wrong. We carry complexity, contradiction, and genuine conviction alongside serious limitations and failures. Understanding this complexity requires intellectual honesty and resistance to simplistic judgments, reflections, and ongoing questions. Looking forward, several questions remain unresolved. Will the organizations he led continue their humanitarian work with the same resources and focus? Will younger religious leaders learn different lessons from his trajectory? Will cultural attitudes toward faith and politics continue evolving in ways that redefine the relevance of his particular approach? The immediate controversy may eventually recede from public consciousness as new events capture attention and new figures emerge to dominate headlines. History tends to be a story constantly being rewritten as priorities shift and new information emerges. Yet the patterns he exemplified will likely persist. Religious leaders will continue navigating the tension between faith conviction and political engagement. Organizational leaders will continue facing challenges around consistency between stated values and actual practices. Public figures will continue discovering that celebrity and influence, while they may feel permanent, can transform rapidly when circumstances change. Perhaps the most productive response isn't determining whether he was right or wrong in some absolute sense, but rather examining what his trajectory reveals about larger dynamics within religious, political, and cultural institutions in contemporary America. What does his story tell us about how power functions, how influence becomes authority, how consequences eventually catch up with contradictions? These are questions worth sustained attention. As for the man himself, life continues. His organizations remain active. He still preaches and speaks publicly, though with different reception than in earlier decades. He lives in the mountains of North Carolina with his wife, reflecting on decades of work, influence, and controversy. Whether he views this period as persecution, accountability, necessary humbling, or some combination remains his private interpretation. What seems clear is that the chapter that many believed was untouchable and permanent has indeed entered a new phase. Whether this represents an ending, a transformation, or a temporary setback remains genuinely unknown. History will ultimately determine how these events are interpreted and understood. For now, we're simply witnessing an unprecedented moment of reckoning. The broader implications, The significance of this moment extends beyond one individual's experience. His journey illustrates principles about power, accountability, and cultural transformation that apply far more broadly than any single person's story. In an era of increasing polarization, his career demonstrates how easily conviction can become instrumentalized for purposes beyond spiritual significance. How easily righteous principle can be redeployed to justify political allegiances that seem less noble than the principle itself. This dynamic plays out across contemporary institutions. Religious organizations that maintain moral authority must demonstrate consistency between stated principles and actual practices, when contradictions become too obvious to ignore. The organization's credibility suffers. This isn't merely a punishment imposed externally, it's a natural consequence of how trust actually functions in human relationships. His story also illustrates how generational change transforms the nature of inherited authority. What previous generations accepted without question, newer generations scrutinize intensely. What felt like permanent influence to him may have always been more fragile than it appeared from the vantage point of wielding it. Understanding these dynamics helps us navigate comparable situations. Where does this leave us? The complete picture includes genuine humanitarian work, authentic religious conviction, troubling statements about other faiths, deepening political alignment, defensive responses to criticism, and eventual accountability that manifested through multiple institutional and cultural channels. We can acknowledge the humanitarian contributions without ignoring the problematic statements. We can recognize genuine faith conviction while still questioning consistency and application. We can appreciate the complexity without retreating into false equivalence that suggests all positions are equally defensible. This is the intellectual and moral work that serious people must undertake. The reckoning we've examined today matters because it raises questions that extend far beyond one religious leader's fate. How should religious organizations balance spiritual authority with political engagement? How should accountability function for figures with significant influence? How should we navigate disagreement about fundamental values without demonizing those we oppose? These questions have no simple answers, but avoiding them guarantees continued confusion and conflict. Accountability without compassion becomes cruelty. Compassion without accountability becomes enabling. Thank you for exploring this complex story with us here at Crime Brief. We believe understanding complicated figures and events requires sustained attention, honest analysis, and willingness to hold multiple truths simultaneously. If you found this investigation valuable, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to Crime Brief for more in-depth explorations of stories that matter. Your engagement directly helps us continue producing this type of comprehensive analysis. Don't miss the linked video on your screen that explores related themes in greater depth. Join us next time as we continue examining the people, events, and dynamics shaping our cultural moment. We appreciate your time and attention. See you soon.